down and saved humankind, made a way, made that we have a possibility of being justified and, Lord, of being sanctified. All those things, Lord, that you've granted through your love. Now, Lord, guide us as we continue to learn through your word. In Jesus' name, amen. Please be seated.
Yes.
No introduction needed.
What?
No introduction needed.
No, you wouldn't want to have to bear the ignominious nature of that introduction. All right. Well, we are, as you know, looking at various and sundry parts of the book of Isaiah. And we are in the section of the book, 40 to 55, where we have these four themes that are woven together in and through the book of going home. They're in Babylonian captivity, and the great prophet says, God's going to take you home. You've paid the price, going to give you another chance. This is one good thing about God. Even when you get judged, you get another chance after you're taken to the woodshed. And then the idea that Yahweh is the creator God. And that was, of course, against the business of the Babylonians, thinking that Marduk, their god Marduk, was the creator God. And then there is this section, or these sections, where we're told that Yahweh is the only God. Now you see, that's strict monotheism, meaning that this God of the Hebrew people, is the only God. Up to this point, Yahweh was supposed to be the only God they worship, but they did not deny the existence of other gods. That's called henotheism, as we said. And then these interesting passages about the servant, and especially these four passages that have to do with what is called the suffering servant. That is a servant who suffers vicariously so somebody else can have opportunity for a better life. We'll get to some of that in just a little bit. But the interesting thing is that probably more ink has been spilled in the scholarly world over who the servant is than just about any other question that arises out of the Old Testament. And there have been books written and articles written, tons of them, about who is the servant. Well, if you read the text, it's clear who the servant is. He identifies the servant. The servant is Israel, the nation of Israel. And you say, well, how can a community of however you want to put it, be a servant? Well, you remember we have talked before about this concept of corporate personality that was afoot in the ancient world, and especially among the Hebrews, where they believed that the group was an individual and that the individuals in the group was the group. Now that's not the way we usually think of it, but that's the way they thought of it. And where is a good example of that, by the way? Do you remember the story about Jericho? When they went into the promised land, they took it over, after a certain series of incidents and battles and so on and so forth. But Jericho was one of the great strongholds that would keep them from exercising authority over this part of Palestine. And so Jericho had to go. And it was a holy war. And back in those days, a holy war, not all wars were holy wars, and not all battles were holy war battles, but this was a holy war battle. And in those days, the idea was that if you invoked the deity to be on your side in the battle, that everything that was captured in the battle had to be devoted to the god. It was called harim, meaning that which is set apart, sanctified for something else. What word in English do we get from that? Harem. Think about that. But at any rate, here we go with the Holy War battle, and everybody knows about. They marched around Jericho and blew the trumpets, and the walls they came a-tumbling down. And of course, this lady named Rahab, who is, according to tradition, later married to Joshua, who was the leader of that group. And interesting, where do you find Rahab? It's a little quiz here. Where do you find Rahab listed again? In the genealogy of Jesus. Go look at Matthew 1, and you'll find a neat little list of 3 sections of 14 generations apiece. And in that list, there are 4 females, one of whom is Rahab. You remember who the other 3 were? I can't hear you. Ruth is one of them, yes. Tamar is one of them. No, Mary isn't listed. Now, Mary isn't there in this one. Interesting because in the Lucan version of the birth narratives, Mary is front and center. In the Matthean birth narrative, it's Joseph who's front and center. Mary is not hardly even mentioned. But there's a reason for that, and we won't go into it here. There's one more woman who is there. She is not named, but she is identified as what? Bathsheba. She is the mother of Solomon. But she's not named. She's just the mother of Solomon. And it's sort of interesting, isn't it, that at least 3, if not all 4 of those females are non-Israelites. They're non-Israelites, which indicates something about the inclusive nature of the Hebrew faith, even back way back, as it were. Well, at any rate, they got the war over, or the battle over, and Jericho was destroyed. And one of the Israelites decided that, see, everything that had to be dedicated to the God that gave you the victory in the battle in that time. And so therefore you would have to take all of the things of any value, put them in a pile and burn them. And you would have to kill everything else that was there, men, women, children, animals, etc. And you say that's barbaric, but that's the way it was back in those days. We don't get to choose, we don't get to impose our morals back upon people in the past, or our ways of thinking upon people in the past. We have to take it straight up, as it were, whether we like the way they did it or not. Well, there was one of the Hebrews who thought, God doesn't really need all of this, and my family could use some. His name was Achan, and he decided that he was going to keep some of the spoils for himself. And so he does, and he hides it in the tent, in the sand under his tent. Well, the next time the Hebrew people go out to battle in the process of taking over the land, it should have been a cakewalk because they went out to fight against this little bird called Ai, and guess what? They got whooped. They got whooped. And Joshua goes in before the Lord and says, "What's going on here? I thought you were on our side. I thought you were going to help us win the victory." You remember what God said to him? Israel has sinned. Now we would say what? Achan has sinned. But when you understand the way they thought corporately, it's not just that Achan sinned, but one member of the community has sinned, ergo the whole community has sinned. Israel has sinned. So they have to ferret out who did this, and they find that Achan was the one who did it. And so what happens? They have to get rid of Achan and his family, because the family unit was sort of a smaller version of the nation or the community, and each individual in it being the community and vice versa. So Achan and his family had to be gotten rid of. And so that was done, and after that it was smooth sailing as far as taking over the land is concerned. But that's the kind that you have to think the way they do in order to understand what's going on. You know, what we do today, one of these days, is probably going to be looked upon as barbaric. And probably they're going to be right. But should we be judged by standards 100 years or 200 years down the road? No, you get judged by the standards that you set, that are set for you at this time and this place. It's sort of like, I've told my students, 57 years worth of them. When you come to interpret the Bible, you don't interpret the Bible according to what we do or don't do today. You sort of let the Bible stand on its own, in its own time and own place. And you get the religious and theological and moral and ethical teaching from what is there. And the thing is, you have a right always to disagree with the Bible. But you don't have the right to change it, because there are always people wanting to change it. They want to read stuff into it that's not there, or simply deny what is there. That's what has happened with many of the bureaucracies of the churches today. They've simply, well, the Bible doesn't say what I want it to say, so we'll just rule that that's not what it said. You know, you have a right to disagree, but you don't have a right to change it, whether you like it or not. You just don't have a right to change it. Well, how did I get off on that? Well, here we go. We're going to come back to this whole business of the servant now. Let's pick it up in Isaiah 48. I think that's where we got this morning, wasn't it? Isaiah 48. Hear this, O house of Jacob, you who are called by the name of Israel, who come forth from the loins of Judah. Remember, by this time, the only Hebrew people that were legitimate Israelites were the people in Judah, because the people in northern Israel had been destroyed. I mean, northern Israel as a nation had been destroyed. And most of the people, they were destroyed by the Assyrians, and the Assyrians then took the people that were there, that were still left after the war, and divided them up and settled them in various and sundry parts of the great Assyrian Empire. And they brought people from other parts of the Assyrian Empire in and settled them in northern Israel. And the people in northern Israelites who were at one time, northern Israel, who were Israelites at one time, as far as the people in the south were concerned, they had now been contaminated. They were no longer true Israelites. And so Judah is, by this time, is the only, considered by the Hebrew people, the only true Israelites that they are. So that's why we've got Judah quite frequently, and Israel now refers to Judah, even though up until northern Israel fell, northern Israel was Israel, and Judah was Judah, but now Judah is both Israel and Judah. But you follow that? All right. Who came forth from the loins of Judah, who sware by the name of Yahweh, and confess the God of Israel, but not in truth or right. You know, as we talked this morning about Amos, Amos makes it clear that you are not really religious and you're not really devotees of Yahweh simply because you put a facade in front of you and go through the motions. You remember, I despise your feast. I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Real religion has to be deeper than just going through the motions of some kind of cultic worship, as it were. I'm always reminded at this point about when I was a young lad, which was a long time ago, and I had been in the divinity school teaching for a number of years, 6 or 8, and I remember the dean called me into his office one day, and we were talking about whatever it was he wanted to talk about. That's what we always talked about, whatever it was he wanted to talk about. So at any rate, the time was getting on, and it was time for what was called the opening convocation, where the faculty and the students would go into the big chapel, and the faculty would process with all of their regalia and so on and so forth. And I remember the dean at that time, marvelous man, very wise. And he said to me, Mickey, he said, we can finish this discussion a little later. He said, we have to get all of our stuff on. He says, I would rather not. He said, but you know, you have to give the faculty a chance every once in a while to preen themselves. I always remember that when I read in the prophecies, in the prophetic materials, that the external show isn't really enough. The external show doesn't really cut it. All it does is to say you think more highly of yourself than you ought to. But that's another matter. So he says, they call themselves after the holy city. They stay themselves on the God of Israel. Yahweh of hosts is his name. Now pick up in chapter 49, verse 1. This is the second of the so-called servant songs. Listen to me, O coastlands. You remember what we said this morning the coastlands meant? The whole world. Because they believed in those days the world was square and flat, and around it was a great ocean. And so if you went as far as you could go in any direction, you would come to coastlands. So the coastlands, here coastlands, meaning here the whole world, hearken you peoples from afar. Yahweh called me from the womb. From the body of my mother he named my name. In other words, Israel was an elect people. You go all the way back to Genesis 12, where God enters into covenant with Abram. And what is Abram and his descendants supposed to do? To make the name of Yahweh and the truth about Yahweh and the kind of God Yahweh was to the whole world, which is quite a responsibility, is it not? And that's what he's talking about here. Yahweh called me from the womb. He was elected to do that particular purpose. You know, there are people who say, well, how do you get to be elect? Well, there are, I think, in the Scripture 2 types of election. One is election to be, in general, the people of God. Individuals make up the people of God. They are elect at that point because they're supposed to do that particular, fulfill that particular responsibility. But there are some who are a bit more specifically elected. Elected to do certain special things on behalf of God or on behalf of God's people. And so he's saying here that Israel, who is the servant, has been specially elected to do this thing. And in order to do it, God made my mouth like a sharp sword. In the shadow of his hand he hid me like a polished arrow, and his quiver hid me away, and said, you are my servant Israel, in whom I will be glorified. Now it's interesting. Why? Because a lot of people say, well, wait a minute, the whoever this is in the servant songs, these 4 that they've picked out and separated from the rest of the material, it's not Israel there. Israel is only the servant in other parts, but not here. Well, but here in this particular servant song, it says what? My servant Israel. Now, it was interesting because for a long time in the history of the Jewish and Christian, how shall we put it, controversies and debates that they had about various and sundry things, the Christians said that the term Israel wasn't in the original. That the Jews had put Israel in here to embarrass the Christians because the Christians wanted to show that Jesus was the suffering servant. Well, how do you bring an end to that argument? Well, for one thing, if you can go back far enough and find the earliest copies of the Hebrew Scripture, you will find whether it's there or not there, this word, Israel. Well, but you couldn't. Why? Because later on, somewhere between the 8th and 10th centuries, there was a group of people called the Masoretes who standardized the Hebrew text of the Hebrew Scriptures. And they got all of the different copies around and brought them together so that they could make a text. Because every time you copy a text, and by the way, they didn't have copy machines back in those days. They had scribes, and scribes sometimes make errors. And sometimes scribes will add something they're not supposed to add. So the Masoretes, these Jewish scholars, got together and tried to standardize the Hebrew text. Well, they got all the ancient copies that they could bring in, and when they standardized the text, they destroyed all those copies. Yeah. So that there would only be one standardized Hebrew text. Now, of course, the scholars say, that was so stupid. That was stupid, but that's what they did. But you see, once that was done, you couldn't check to see if Israel was in any of the earlier ones until the Dead Sea Scrolls came along in the late 40s. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls was a full copy of the book of Isaiah. Voila! A full copy. And everybody was so excited to see, because the first, this was a first century BC copy. It was before Jesus ever came along. And so the scholars were all agog, especially with this particular point. Does it say Israel or not? Guess what? It said Israel. It said Israel. And boy, there were people scattering all over the place trying to undo that fiasco on the part of some who wanted to say that Israel wasn't the servant, and he wasn't identified as a servant in these songs, but lo and behold, he was. Well, my servant in whom, Israel, in whom I will be glorified. But I said, I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for nothing in vanity. Surely my right is with Yahweh, and my recompense with my God. And now Yahweh says, who formed me from the womb to be his servant, to bring Jacob back to him, that Israel might be gathered to him, for I am honored in the eyes of Yahweh, and my God has become my strength. God says, it is too light a thing that you should be my servant, only to raise up the tribes of Jacob and restore the preserved of Israel. Because the servant is going to do what? Going to be the agent by which Israel is going to be restored. It's too light a thing just to do that. God has a bigger and better purpose for Israel, the servant. I want to give you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the ends of the earth. And this is, of course, what Israel was supposed to do to begin with. And this is what the church today, as a successor to Israel, is supposed to be up to as well. To take the revelation and the salvation of God to the ends of the earth. You see, we are the servant. The church is the servant. As Israel was a servant, the church is the servant. And the church has a task to perform. The church has a duty to do what it is that they're called upon to do, to make the revelation of God known to all the world. For the coastlands, remember, wait for God's instruction. Yes, ma'am.
How come people care so much who was the servant?
Say that again.
How come people cared so much about whether it said Israel or the servant?
Well, it's because there are some who want to indicate that the servant is Jesus.
So that they themselves didn't want to.
And the point is that in the text, it isn't Jesus. But later on, we will see, there's another one or two of these things coming along, you see, the prophets lay down principles, values, ideas, whatever. And these principles or ideas are always there. And when somebody steps up to do what it is that the principle says we ought to do, then that scripture gets fulfilled. And so they wanted to emphasize that Jesus was the servant, and it sort of took the, how shall we put it, the edge off of the responsibility of the whole community of faith to do what it was that the servant was commanded to do. You know, we're always trying to weasel out of stuff, aren't we? I don't really want to do that. I don't really want to, somebody else can do that. Well, no, we're under obligation to do that. So it was a big deal for some people. It was a big deal for some people. Then in chapter 50, we have another one of these songs. Chapter 50, verses 4 through probably 11, but some scholars will cut it off at 9. The Lord Yahweh has given, 50 verse 4. The Lord Yahweh has given me the tongue of those who are taught, that I may know how to sustain with the word whoever is weary. Morning by morning he wakens my ear to hear as those who are taught. The Lord Yahweh has opened my ear. I was not rebellious. I turned not backward. I gave my back to the spiders and my cheeks to those who pull out the beard. I hid not my face from shame and spitting. And of course, since that was some of what happened to Jesus when he was crucified, they want to make that a prediction of Jesus. But anybody who does what God wants them to do is going to be persecuted. There ain't no question about that. It's happened all the way. Israel, the Christians. What do you think about the Christians today being slaughtered all over the world? I remember especially those couple years ago, those Coptic Christians who from Egypt who were taken out to the shores of the Mediterranean and told if they would renounce their Jesus, they would live. If not, they were going to get beheaded. Well, this is a kind of poetic way of saying the same thing. If you don't renounce your God, your Jesus, whatever it is you stand for, you're going to die. And guess what? All 21 of them did. Not a single one renounced Jesus. They all suffered martyrdom by having their heads cut off. That's a nice bunch, isn't it? Well, but that's another matter. The Lord God helps me. Therefore I have not been confounded. I set my face like a flint, and I know I shall not be put to shame. The one who vindicates me is near, meaning God, who is the one who is going to vindicate the servant, is near, meaning God. Who will contend with me? Let us stand up together. Who is my adversary? Let him come near. Behold, the Lord Yahweh helps me. Who will declare me guilty? Behold, all of them will wear out like a garment, and the moth will eat them up. Who among you fears Yahweh and obeys the voice of his servant? The one who walks in darkness and has no light, yet trusts in the name of the Lord and relies upon his God. In other words, this is a challenge to the people of Israel in captivity to keep the faith and stay the course. That God is going to allow them to go home. And you say, well, but what about the people who got martyred? Well, what about them? They paid the price so somebody else could have opportunity for a better life. And that's what you get when you get to the last of these servant songs, the whole principle of vicarious suffering. Somebody who's willing to suffer and even to die so that somebody else can have opportunity for a better life. And of course, that happens all the time, doesn't it? Parents who sacrifice for their children, friends who sacrifice for each other, and so on. But who fulfills, meaning fills full, that concept of vicarious service to the nth degree? Jesus does, yeah. pick it up in 52:13. Behold, my servant will prosper. Notice again, this is about the servant. He shall be exalted and lifted up, and shall be very high. As many were astonished at him, his appearance was so marred beyond human semblance, and his form beyond that of the children of men. So shall he startle many nations. Kings shall shut their mouths because of him, for that which has not been told them they will see, and that which they have not heard they will understand. Who has believed what we have heard? And to whom has the arm of Yahweh been revealed? He grew up before him like a young plant, like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or comeliness that we should look at him, no beauty that we should despise him. He was despised and forsaken by men. He was a man of pain and acquainted with sickness. A man of pain, acquainted with sickness. As one from whom people hide their faces. He was despised and we esteemed him not. Now it's interesting because one of the very popular interpretations of this is that the great prophet here was using someone who was known to the people in captivity. And that someone who was known was a leprous teacher of the law, meaning of the Torah. And that he had leprosy, and that all of these things here that are a man of sickness, acquainted with pain, etc., 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 would fit a leprous teacher of the law. And of course, that's a very popular, in some circles, interpretation of who the servant was. Who the pattern for the servant was. Now, I don't know. You can pay as your money and take your choice at that point. I don't know that he needs that we need what shall we call it, a pattern or a prototype there. These people in captivity would understand that we're here, this describes us. After all, we are the servant. Israel is the servant, so that describes them. Surely he has borne our sicknesses and carried our pain. Yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted, wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that made us whole, and with his stripes we are healed. We are like sheep, have gone astray, turned everyone to his own way, and Yahweh has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He's talking about the people who were conquered, brought into exile, and stayed together. This is a description of somebody who was willing to suffer so that there might be a possibility of hope for somebody else who came in the future, who would also be Israel, by the way. In other words, you're talking Israel early and Israel later here. And so therefore, he was oppressed and afflicted, yet opened not his mouth, like a lamb led to the slaughter, like a sheep before its shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. And as for his generation, who considered that he was cut off out of the land of the living, stricken for the transgression of my people? And they made his grave with the wicked and a rich man in his death, although he had done no violence, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the will of Yahweh to bruise him and to make him sick. And when he gives himself as an offering for sin, he shall see his offspring and prolong his days. His offspring? If that is a prediction of Jesus, then we got trouble, don't we? Because we don't really believe that Jesus was married and had children. And God forbid that we would believe that he had children without being married. that would not be good. You say, well, all of this seems to fit. Well, sure it does, because anytime you get a situation where people are being persecuted and they're holding up under the persecution and all kinds of difficult and evil things are happening to them. And remember, this is poetry, not actual prose, it's poetry, so you have to understand that you're getting across ideas here rather than simply factual data. But the truth of the matter is that if these people who came to Babylon will keep the faith and stay the course, they will be the ones who will form the foundation for a new community of faith that will be restored. Remember, one of the great themes of this particular section is you're going to get to go home and rebuild your lives. Of course, they thought that whenever they got home, everything's going to come up rosy. Well, real life doesn't work that way always, does it? But they did get to go home, and they did form the foundation for the community of faith as it evolved from that particular point. I will divide him a portion with the great, divide the spoil with the strong, because he poured out his life to death and was numbered with the transgressors. Yes, he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. In other words, he was willing, or the community of faith at that point was willing to pay the price, to suffer, so that the community could continue to go on until God would bring the people back home again. So you see, all of that is woven together in these passages. And as I said this morning, I think, this particular part of Isaiah is considered the most beautiful poetry and beautiful literature in all of the Hebrew Scriptures. It is absolutely magnificent, some of it. Vicarious suffering. That's the theological theme here. Somebody who's willing to suffer so somebody else can have opportunity for a better life. I'm always reminded when I think about this passage and the theology of it. I had a very marvelous teacher, and later became a colleague and friend, who taught in the divinity school way back in the 30s. And he used to tell this story. It's a true story, by the way. The true story is that there was a young man in Durham whose father had deserted the family when he was a very young child. And his mother decided to do all she recognized in this particular young man a brilliance that she felt should not ever be squelched and that ought to be enhanced. So she, at the risk of her own life, took 2 jobs so that this young man could have opportunity. Now, he worked too. I remember Dr. Steinspring telling me that he had a paper route and he did some other part-time jobs as well to help out. But his mother worked 2 jobs. So he would have the opportunity, once he graduated from high school, to go to college. He went to Duke. And also to get a master's degree. That's all that Duke offered at that time in the field of Semitic languages. Dr. Steinspring was the one who honchoed that back in those days. And because of this woman's sacrifice, she died an early death. She worked herself basically to death, so that son could have opportunity to expand his God-given brain so that he would have opportunity to use it for the betterment in some way or other. And she died. Well, you say, what happened to the young man? Well, Duke didn't give a PhD in those days to religious studies, so this young man went to Yale and got a PhD there. And I won't tell you what it is in because some of you will go try to figure it out. But this particular young man became the outstanding world's expert in the area in which he majored, which I'm sure his mother would have been very proud. But he couldn't have done it if she hadn't been willing to give herself up so he could have an opportunity for a better life. And also, through him, others could have better opportunity for a better life also. That's what vicarious suffering is about. And of course, as we say over and over again, who fulfilled that theological truth to the nth degree? Jesus did. Yes, Jesus did. And that's what these suffering servant passages is all about. Vicarious suffering. And of course, unfortunately, whether we like it or not, we're called upon to do the same thing, aren't we? We're called upon to suffer. And there are different kinds of suffering. Now, don't get me wrong, there's just not one kind, but various and sundry kinds of suffering, or putting others first, or however you want to put it. But the theology of it is that you do something that costs you so somebody else can have a better life. And that, of course, gets fulfilled many, many times, doesn't it? Especially parents with children and friends with friends and so on and so forth. It's there. Well, then this particular, we need to take a break in just a little. We'll try to finish up. Let me try to finish up Isaiah 40 to 55. Of course, those of you who were here this morning, remember that we did the responsive reading from the 55th chapter here, didn't we? Wasn't that it? Ho, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. He who has no money, come buy and eat. Buy wine and milk without honey or price. Why do you spend your money for that which isn't bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? Hearken diligently to me and eat what is good. Delight yourself in fatness. Incline your ear. Come to me. Hear that you may live, and I will make with you a long-lasting covenant, my steadfast, pure love, sure love for David. Behold, I made him a witness to the peoples, a leader and a commander for the nations, for the peoples. Behold, you shall call nations that you know not, and nations that knew you not shall run to you. In other words, if you keep the faith, stay the course, God's going to restore you in the land, and you're going to be something. God's going to make something out of you, in spite of all this, the problems that you have right now. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts. And let them return to Yahweh, so that Yahweh may have mercy on them, and to our God, who will abundantly pardon. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, says the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than yours, and my thoughts than yours. For as the rain and the snow come down from heaven and return not thither, but water the earth, making it bring forth and sprout, giving seed to the sower and bread to the eater, so shall my word be that goes forth from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty, but it shall accomplish that which I propose, and prosper in the thing for which I sent it. For you will go out in joy. What's the first thing that we see in this segment of Isaiah? The promise that God is going to let them go home, and in fact going to lead them there himself. And the concluding oracle is, you will go out in joy. Out from where? Babylon, of course. You will go out in joy and be led forth in peace. The mountains and the hills before you will bring forth into singing. And this was this was before the sound of music even, wasn't it? And the trees of the field shall clap their hands. Now, is there anybody who thinks that's literal? That's poetic. It gets across a meaning, and if you just let your mind soar with that kind of thought, that the mountains will sing and the trees will clap their hands at this magnificent thing that God is going to bring about. Namely, God's going to let you go home again and reestablish the relationship with you so you can do and be what it was that God intended you to do and be to begin with. Instead of the thorn will come up the cypress, instead of the briar shall come up the myrtle, and it shall be to Yahweh for a memorial, for a long-lasting sign which shall not be cut off. Now remember, I think I've said this to you before, but need to probably say it again. When you read the word everlasting or forever in the Hebrew Scriptures, notice, not the New Testament, that's a whole different world. But when you read the term everlasting or forever in the English translations, it don't mean that in the Hebrew. The Hebrews don't really have a real concept of forever. They have a concept of a long time. The words that are used and are translated, Lo Olam and Al Olam, mean to the age, meaning for a period of time. And so therefore, when you read forever or everlasting, you should think in your mind, wait a minute, that means for a long time. Forever in the New Testament means forever. But you see, things evolve. And revelation is made to people and they understand it in increments sometimes. Because what? Why didn't God just lay everything out on Abraham? Because he wouldn't have been able to understood it. He wasn't able to do it. He couldn't have comprehended it. It took God's revelation to these people over a period of time so that they ultimately came to understand the faith as we know it in the way that we know it. It's not that God changed. It was that we just weren't ready for some of this. And maybe, we still ain't ready for some more revelation that God may be willing and ready to lay on us. Think about that. All right. How many? 10 minutes? 5 minutes?
At the most.
Huh?
10 minutes at the most.
10 minutes at the, you're not here in 10 minutes, I'm going to start talking, whether you're back or not. Now, you want to tell them where to go? Well, maybe I shouldn't give. book of Isaiah. Chapters 56 to 66, almost all reputable scholars, notice how carefully I have to say these things, almost all reputable scholars say that this particular material comes from the 5th century. The material in 1 to 39, most of it comes from the 8th century. 40 to 55 comes from the 6th century. 56 to 66 comes from the 5th century. Because the people are now back in the land. And remember when they got to come back? In 538. You remember they went into exile in 586. They were in exile in Babylon until 538. Cyrus the Persian conquered Babylon and told all the conquered peoples they could go home, reestablish themselves in their land, worship their gods, build the temples back, and he gave them all of the artifacts that had been stolen from their temples and their religious relics. He gave them all back. Said, you can go back and start worshiping your own God again, which was pretty enlightened for that day and that time, but it was also sort of self-serving because it meant that it just enlarged the Persian Empire. Because these people weren't free, they were going to be part of the Persian Empire. More taxes. Yeah, that's always the case, isn't it? More taxes. So here we go. Now, in 56 to 66, things sometimes are all over the place. Sometimes the rhetoric is very high and very positive, and other times it's very negative. Because when they came back, they didn't find anything except what was left when they were taken away. So they had to start from scratch. They had no money. They had no resources. They weren't a free and independent state. They were ruled over, at least for a while, by a Persian governor. So you see, they weren't even able to rule themselves for a while. So that was sort of a down thing. And they didn't have enough to eat. We'll talk more about that a little bit later on. Here we go. It starts off very positive, very inclusive. Thus says Yahweh, keep justice, do righteousness, for soon my salvation will come and my deliverance be revealed. Meaning, things are going to get better. I know things are bad right now, but things are going to get better. Blessed is the person who does this, and the person who holds it fast, the one who keeps the Sabbath, not profaning it, and keeps his hand from doing evil. Let not the foreigner who has joined himself to Yahweh say, Yahweh will surely separate me from this people. And let not the eunuch say, behold, I am a dry tree. For thus says Yahweh to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose the things that please me and hold fast my covenant, I will give in my house and within my walls. What is that a reference to? Within my house. The temple, sure. A monument and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them a long-lasting name which will not be cut off. Now, this is very open and inclusive. Why? Because under the old, how shall we put it? The old house coffin of the Hebrew people before they went into captivity, aliens were not really allowed to be full-fledged Israelites. And of course, a eunuch couldn't be either. But here, now, they do what? He says the aliens are welcome, and the eunuchs are welcome. Well, we know why the aliens are welcome. Why? Because they need all the help they can get in rebuilding. And what about these eunuchs? Why would he mention explicitly the eunuchs. Well, in those days, notice again how you have to go back and pick up things from the past. In those days, when a nation conquered another nation and carried the people off into captivity, the people who were captive lived in sort of a segregated place by themselves. And the powers that be would go through these, it wasn't just the Hebrews, it was anybody who was captured, and they would basically pick out the brightest young boys they could find and train them, take them away from the community where they were, and train them to do things in the bureaucracy of the state. And in order so that, how shall I put this delicately? In order that they not get too rambunctious, especially with the king's harem, they had them all castrated. They become eunuchs. They were castrated. And of course, under the old Jewish law, a eunuch, anybody who had a physical deformity, could not be understood as a full-fledged card-carrying member of the community of faith. But here it says the eunuchs are welcome. Why? Again, because they needed them, and also because probably many of these young men, after all, when Cyrus told them they could go home, he sent the boys who had been, or the men by that time, who had suffered this injustice, sent them back to their own people, and their own people took them back with them. Well, they had been highly skilled, highly trained in affairs of state and things that were practical and so on and so forth. So it was to their advantage to take them back and say, you can be part of the community of faith, full-fledged membership. That's a very inclusive thing, isn't it? And one that ought to have been there to begin with, but wasn't. And he says in verse 6, the foreigners who join themselves to Yahweh to minister to him, to love the name of Yahweh and to be his servants, everyone who keeps the Sabbath and doesn't profane it, holds fast my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Again, a reference to the temple. When was the temple rebuilt? Somewhere between 520 and 515. Haggai and Zechariah, those two prophets, had to challenge the people to get the temple rebuilt, because that was the focal point that held the community of faith and the faith itself together for the Hebrew people back in those days. I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar. For my house will be called a house of prayer for all peoples. Thus says Yahweh, who gathers the outcast of Israel. I will gather yet others to them besides those already gathered. In other words, come on in, join us. Help us rebuild our community, our nation, our whatever you want to call it. Help us, and let's all go together. And let's be sure, though, that we are focused on the same thing and revolve around the same thing, namely the worship of the God of Israel in the temple. Because you remember that it was during the time of Jeremiah. There was a religious reform movement in 626 to 621 BC called the Deuteronomic Reform or the Josianic Reform. Same thing, it's just different names for the same thing. Josiah was the king at that time and actually commissioned this reform movement. And a lot of things were done in that reform movement to clean up all of the things that were going on in Israel at that time that shouldn't have been going on. And so what happened was that the Deuteronomic reform, the Josianic reform, outlawed all of the shrines and temples and places of worship throughout the land and brought all legitimate worship of Yahweh to the temple in Jerusalem. And technically speaking, in a sense, what? That's the same way it is today, isn't it? Technically speaking, we say that they go worship in the synagogue, and many of the Reformed Jews and so on will say we worship in the synagogue. But technically speaking, the only place a true Jew can worship is in the temple in Jerusalem. Well, guess what? There ain't one there now. And there was a group of people, and there still is a group of people called the Temple Mount group, I think it's called, whose basic idea is that we want to get a Jewish temple built back where the old Jewish temple was. Well, in the first place, you can't do that. Why? What sits on the place of the Dome of the Rock Mosque sits on the place where the old temple was. And you try to tear that down and build a Jewish temple there. You talk about a wild scene, you'll have it. And some of them understood that, but some of them said, well, you know, maybe we are wrong in the placement of it. So I believe over here in this open space is where it was. So we'll build one over there. Well, the Muslims aren't going to allow that either without all kinds of a bloody war. But there are those who are still agitating for the rebuilding of a Jewish temple over there in Jerusalem. Well, it all goes back to the time of Josiah. Where all legitimate worship of the God of Israel has to be done in the temple in Jerusalem. If you don't have a temple, what do? Well, you keep the traditions. You keep the Sabbath, for example. You celebrate Yom Kippur. You celebrate Rosh Hashanah, New Year. You celebrate Pentecost. We do that too, you know. You celebrate the Feast of Ingathering. You celebrate Sukkoth, meaning the Feast of Tabernacles or Booths, where they wandered in the wilderness and so on and so forth. That's how you keep it alive, but technically speaking, you ain't worshiping because you're not in the temple. Now, most of the Jews I know today, most of them are Reformed, and conservative, and they will tell you they worship. But the conservatives are still a little bit more, how shall I put it, reluctant to say that. And it's out of that conservative group that the Temple Mount group comes. Well, that's another matter. But at any rate, the temple has been restored. People are invited to come. Come one, come all. All you got to do is be faithful to the God of Israel and worship in this temple. Now we turn to chapter 57, when whoever this prophet is, and many commentators think there may be more than one prophet's teachings incorporated into this section. We don't know that, but there are indications that maybe that's true, but that's not a big issue. You deal with what's there. And in chapter 57, let's pick it up in verse 4. He's talking about the fact that things just aren't right. People are doing things that they shouldn't do. And he picks it up and he says, verse 4, "Of whom are you making sport? Against whom do you open your mouth wide and put out your tongue? Are you not children of transgression, the offspring of deceit, you who burn with lust among the oaks, under every green tree, who slay your children in the valleys, under the clefts of the rocks?" Two things. One, the reference to burning with lust upon the oaks. That is a reference back to way back yonder when Baalism was the chief rival for the people of God, Yahweh's people of God, not too long after they came into the land of Canaan, and for a long time after that. And Baalism was basically a fertility rite. And of course, as you know, we've said before, that they believed in those days in what is called sympathetic or mimetic magic, meaning that if you do something on a small scale, it would bring something about on the larger scale. In other words, if you wanted it to rain, what would you do? You'd pour out water. And they thought that doing that in a proper way and ritualistic way would bring it about. That's what we mean by sympathetic or mimetic magic, and they practiced it back in those days. The Hebrews weren't supposed to, but they did. And so one of the things that the prophets, early and late, had to deal with was the lure of Baalism, because Baalism was a fertility religion. And there was a myth associated with it. And the myth was this, that once upon a time, there was the great god, chief of the gods, named El. And there were other lesser gods, one of whom was named Baal. And each of the lesser gods had control over a certain area of what goes on in this world. And so the god of the Canaanites was Baal. And the god Baal gave the crops, made the crops increase so they'd have something to eat, and the flocks and the herds increased so they, would have wealth that way, and also something to eat that way, and so on and so forth. Well, Baal was pretty popular. But there were two other gods, one of whom was named Mot, meaning death, and the other Yam, which was the sea. And they were very jealous of Baal. And so they decided they didn't like his popularity, and so they killed him. And of course, when they killed him, what happened to the crops? What happened to the herds? They went down the tubes. And the people finally got to hurting so bad, they went to the chief god El and said, "Look, if you don't bring Baal back to life, you ain't going to have there aren't going to be any people for you to have worship you." Well, El said, they did, Yam and Mot did kill Baal, and he's dead now. But I get your point. So El, in his great wisdom, decided that Baal could be alive for 6 months and dead for 6 months, which of course is a way of explaining what? The seasons, yeah. And so here's old Baal. He's been dead for a long time. And I hate to have to tell you this, but how does Baal get wakened from his deathly sleep? His girlfriend goes and wakes him up. His wife, his girlfriend, whatever they want. It depends on the various sundry versions of it. But Baal's been asleep and away from his girlfriend for what? A long time. Do I need to draw you a picture? I don't think so. But that, of course, gets everything going again. And with this idea of sympathetic or mimetic magic, people say, well, you know, if we emulate the union of Baal with his consort, then that will ensure that our crops will grow and our flocks will increase and so on and so forth. So as a result, part of the worship of Baal included sacred prostitution. And it was incumbent basically upon almost all of the young women of a community to serve in the Baal temples, or whatever you want to call them, for a certain period of time. And then, of course, they could go and do whatever it was they wanted to do with getting married and having children, a family, and all like that. And you say, gee, that sounds like Epstein, doesn't it? But at any rate, that's what happened. And so it's interesting because in the old King James, these high places of worship were called groves. If you have an old King James and you're reading in some of the prophets, they talk about what's going on in the groves. Well, actually, we know what was going on in the groves. And Dr. Steinspring, who was a magnificent Semitic scholar, Semitic languages scholar, said that the people who translated the Old King James didn't know what these groves were, but they knew something shady was going on there. And he was right. And they knew something shady was going on there. And of course, Baalism was always a no-no as far as the Hebrew people were concerned. And then it says, who slay your children in the valleys under the clefts of the rocks. Well, in those days, there were, in that particular part of the world, certain gods that required the slaughter of young children, especially infants, and they would take their babies to the altar of this or that god, usually Moloch, the god Moloch, who is mentioned a little bit later in this passage, and they would kill them and think that would win the favor of the god. And some have interpreted it that way, who slay your children in the valleys. But under the clefts of the rocks doesn't sound like sacrificial altar, does it? And so many commentators think that what's being talked about here is that these people don't have enough food to go around. And so when people are having babies, see, they didn't have the pill back then. And so they had too many babies to feed and no food to feed them. And so they were doing what some of the old Romans and Greeks used to do. Namely, if they had children that they didn't want or like, they just took them out in the wilderness and left them out there for them to die either from exposure, starvation, or at the hand of some wild animal. And according to this, that ain't the way we're supposed to handle little babies. Sound familiar? Well, at any rate, all these things are coming abroad. Pick it up in chapter 58. He says, there are people who are saying, well, we try to do right. Pick it up in verse 358. Why have we fasted and you haven't seen us? In other words, we're going around here fasting and we're making a big show out of it, but God, you haven't rewarded us for fasting. Isn't that something? We always want to be rewarded because we think we ought to be. They did too. He said, behold, in the day of your fast you seek your own pleasure and oppress all your workers. Behold, you fast only to quarrel and fight and hit with wicked fist. Fasting like yours this day will not make your voice be heard on high. Is this not the fast that I choose? A day for a person to humble oneself? Is it to bow down one's head like a rush and to spread sackcloth and ashes under him? Will you call this a fast, a day acceptable to Yahweh? Is this not the fast that I choose? To loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free and break every yoke. Obviously, there are some things going on here that ought not to be going on. That some of these Israelites are using in a very wrongful way other Israelites. And he says, is it not to share your bread with the hungry, to bring the homeless poor into your house, and when you see him naked to cover him, and not to hide oneself from your own flesh? In other words, you're supposed to look out for the people in your community. And if you don't look out for the people in your community, you're not being what it is Yahweh wants you to be, and you're not the kind of community Yahweh wants this community to be. If you do this, however, then shall your light break forth like the dawn, and your healing shall spring up speedily. Your righteousness shall go before you, and the glory of Yahweh will be your rear guard. And when you call, Yahweh will answer. You will cry, and Yahweh will say, I'm here. I'm here. But you got to do what it is that Yahweh wants you to do. You got to be what it is that Yahweh wants you to be. So he goes on, and he says, chapter 59, behold, the Lord's hand is not shortened that it cannot save, or God's ear dull that it cannot hear. But your iniquities have made a separation between yourself and your God, and your sins have hidden his face from you so that he does not hear. Your hands are defiled with blood, and your fingers with iniquity. Your lips have spoken lies. Your tongue mutters wickedness. No one enters suit justly. No one goes to law honestly. That sounds sort of familiar too. They rely on empty pleas. They speak lies. They conceive mischief and bring forth iniquity. They hatch adder's eggs and weave a spider's web. Whoever eats their eggs dies, and from one which is crushed, the viper is hatched. In other words, you've got evil just beginning to spread all over this community of faith, and God isn't happy about that. Then chapter 60, arise and shine, for your light has come. The glory of Yahweh has risen upon you. Darkness will cover the earth, thick darkness the people. But Yahweh will rise upon you, and his glory will be seen upon you, and nations will come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your rising, which is the way it ought to be. Others ought to be able to see that what you have is something they ought to have. And you can teach them. That's what the community of faith was called into being to do. And then he begins to talk about how this new era is going to be understood. Now remember, this is poetry, but it's beautiful poetry. Pick it up in chapter 60, verse 19. The sun shall no more be your light by day, nor for brightness shall the moon give light by night. But Yahweh will be your long-lasting light. Your God will be your glory. Your sun will not go down, nor your moon withdraw itself, for Yahweh will be your everlasting light, and your days of mourning shall be ended. In other words, it's tough now, but keep the faith. Do what you're supposed to do. It will get better. Of course, that's hard for us. We're not very patient, are we, as human beings? And of course, if we're in the midst of being, in the midst of difficult times, you understand, I understand, why you get impatient. But patience is a virtue, to use that old cliche. It is a virtue. And it's interesting because from this point to the end of Isaiah 56 to 66, you will find lots and lots and lots of figures which are used in the book of Revelation. And because the book of Revelation is talking about a new age with the persecution gone. Remember, apocalyptic is persecution literature, where God's people are being persecuted, and it's difficult. It's difficult. But God says, keep the faith and stay the course. It will get better. And that's what this is all about here. So this is looking forward to a new time and age in Israel's history, or Judah's history. But it's understood to be also a way of saying, if God can bring good out of this evil, then God can bring good out of the evil that's going on later on. You see, in a kind of fulfillment type way. The Spirit of the Lord Yahweh is upon me. Chapter 61, verse 1. Because Yahweh has anointed me to bring good tidings to the afflicted, has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of Yahweh's favor. Where do you see that again?
Jesus, synagogue.
Which gospel? Yeah. Well, each one of the gospels has its own way of telling the story. In Mark, first thing Jesus does is call disciples. In Matthew, the first thing Jesus does is preaches the Sermon on the Mount. In Luke, the first thing Jesus does is goes to the synagogue, opens it, and says, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." The interesting thing is, though, that Luke, in telling that, cuts off the last section here, which is to proclaim the year of Yahweh's favor. That's where Luke stops it. But the passage here reads, "the day of vengeance of our God." Meaning the people who are persecuting you are going to get theirs. Well, that didn't suit Luke, and it wasn't appropriate for Luke. And so therefore Luke uses just part of that as a fulfillment. Notice again, a fulfillment. He says, to grant to those who mourn in Zion, to give them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning, a mantle of praise instead of a faint spirit, that they may be called oaks of righteousness, the planting of Yahweh, that Yahweh may be glorified. They shall build up the ancient ruins. They shall raise up former devastations. They will repair the ruined cities, the devastations of many generations. In other words, what's going on here? The challenge to rebuild the community, because they were very remiss, as it were, in rebuilding the way they should have rebuilt. Most of them were obviously rebuilding for their own comfort rather than for the comfort of the community as a whole. And what was needed was the whole community needed to be rebuilt, because it was still, remember, they just come back and it's in shambles. It says, aliens shall stand and feed your flocks. Foreigners will be your plowmen and vine dressers, but you will be called priests of Yahweh. And people will speak of you as the ministers of our God. You will eat the wealth of the nations, and in their riches you will glory. Instead of your shame, I will have a double portion. Instead of dishonor, you will rejoice in your lot. In other words, things are going to get better. Therefore, in your land you will possess a double portion, and yours will be a long-lasting joy. For I, Yahweh, love justice. Meaning what? What does justice mean? What? God requires. I hate robbery and wrong. I will faithfully give them their recompense. I will make a long-lasting covenant with them. Chapter 62, verse 1, for Zion's sake I will not keep silent. For Jerusalem's sake I will not rest until her vindication goes forth as brightness and her salvation as a burning torch. The nations shall see your vindications, and all the kings your glory. You will be called by a new name, which the mouth of Yahweh will give. You will be a crown of beauty in the hand of the Lord, a golden diadem in the hand of your God. You will no longer be called forsaken, and your land will be no longer termed desolate, but you will be called, my delight is in her, and your land married. For Yahweh delights in you, and your land shall be married, meaning married to Yahweh. Upon your walls, O Jerusalem, verse 6, I have set watchmen all the days of the night that will never be silent. You who put the Lord in remembrance, take no rest, and give God no rest until God establishes Jerusalem and makes its praise in the earth. Notice here he talks about the walls. Stand on the walls. When were the walls rebuilt?
444.
All right. 444, under the direction of Nehemiah, with a FEMA grant from the Persian government. That's true in a sense. I mean, put it in our kind of terminology. But that was 444, so the walls got rebuilt. But obviously Jerusalem has not been rebuilt yet and repopulated. So Nehemiah will come back again in 432 and help rebuild Jerusalem and repopulate it. Sort of interesting, because if you read Ezra and Nehemiah, you will find that when Nehemiah got the city ready to be repopulated, he invited people to come and live in Jerusalem. And the response was so underwhelming that he mandated that certain people have to live in Jerusalem. Isn't that interesting? You see, again, this shows you just how difficult these times were. He says, I have, verse 63, verse 3, I have trodden the winepress alone. Where do you see that figure again? In the back. You would know he had come up with a musical term. How about the book of Revelation? Even better than the Battle Hymn of the Republic. But I have trodden the winepress alone. And then he goes on to talk about, all these things that he's going to do. Chapter 64, verse 8. Yet, O Yahweh, you are our Father. We are the clay, and you are our potter. We are the work of your hand. We are the clay, and you are the potter. Bet he got that from the hymn writer too, don't you? We are the work of your hand. Be not exceedingly angry, O Yahweh, and remember not our iniquity forever, meaning on and on and on. Behold, consider we are all your people. Thy holy cities have become a wilderness, Zion as a wilderness, Jerusalem a desolation. O holy and beautiful house where our fathers praise you has been burned by fire, and all our pleasant places have become ruins. Now it's interesting because there are two interpretations possible here. One is that this particular passage was uttered not long after they came back from Babylon, and the temple had not yet been restored. And this is a reference to the first destruction of that temple. There are others who think, and there's some good evidence to that, but it's not really mutually accepted in the academic community, which not everything is anyway, and probably shouldn't be, but that's another matter. The idea was that they had gotten this little temple rebuilt under the prodding of Haggai and Zechariah. They got the temple rebuilt. It's interesting because Haggai says when the people saw the new temple, they wept because it wasn't anything like the old one. That is the Solomonic temple. But it was the temple anyway, and it was the place where Yahweh was supposed to be worshiped. But according to some theorists, that temple was also destroyed because there is evidence here that Edom, whenever the Hebrew people came back from captivity and were reestablishing themselves in the land, that the Edomites, which is right across the river from them, kept on harassing them and running raids in there and destroying things. And there are those who believe that this is a reference to the fact that the Edomites had destroyed the temple they had rebuilt, and so they were going to have to rebuild it again, which of course they obviously did after a while. But it's interesting because over in chapter 63, it says, verse 1, who is this that comes from Edom in crimson garments from Bozrah, who is glorious in his apparel, marching in the greatness of his strength? Well, who is it that's coming from Edom in crimson garments? Yahweh. Why? Because Yahweh is taking a toll on Edom for what it has been doing to little old Judah. So you see, that would fit in with the fact that maybe this is a reference to the temple that has been destroyed. And so much of this you can look and say, pick it up in chapter 66. Thus says Yahweh, heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. What is the house which you would build for me, and the place of my rest? In other words, they've already built a temple. It's already been referenced here as sacrifices. But now it says it's okay if you don't rebuild it.
66.
66 verse 1. What is the house? 66 verse 1. What is the house which you would build for me in the place of my rest? All these things my hand has made, so all these things is mine. In other words, I don't really need a temple. I don't really need a house. So don't worry about that as much as rebuilding your community, as it were. The one who slaughters an ox is like a person who kills a man. Meaning what? We have so little food. You don't waste it on sacrificing to me. I don't need it, God says. I don't need it. And whoever sacrifices a lamb, like a person who breaks a dog's neck. Whoever presents a cereal offering, like one who offers swine's blood. Boy, that would not be welcome in the house of Yahweh, would it? Or as an offering to Yahweh. So, at any rate, pick it up now in 66:22. For as the new heavens and the new earth which I will make shall remain before me, says Yahweh, so shall your descendants and your name remain from new moon to new moon, from Sabbath to Sabbath, and all flesh shall come to worship before me. Thus says Yahweh. In other words, God is going to make a new day for the people here. And how is that going to be done? They will go forth and look at the dead bodies of the people that have rebelled against me. Their worm will not die, their fire will not be quenched, and they shall be an abhorrence to all flesh. In other words, if the people of God are going to be left alone so they can become what it is God wants them to do, people who are coming in and trying to whoop up on these poor people, and according to some of the text in other places, it seems that Edomites and others would come in around, around harvest time and steal their food. And you can understand why they would want those people punished. We probably would too, wouldn't we? Think about that. Well, this is really interesting. The book of Isaiah just covers the waterfront in many ways with regard to what prophecy is all about. And you have to understand that all of the prophets speak to a specific time and place in the history of the development of the Hebrew people. History changes, so do some of the prophetic utterances. And you see that in these three particular components of the book of Revelation, the book of Isaiah. 8th century, 6th century, 5th century, all different times, all different circumstances. But the God of Israel is with these people even when they don't realize He's there. Maybe sometimes that's the way we are. We have a tendency to think if everything isn't going swimmingly for us, that God isn't there. But that's really the time when God is more likely to be there than not. Think about that. Well, all right. I think I'm out of time. What do you want to do now?
Well, we'll see if there's any questions.
Okay. I can stumble through again. Oh, last night
Questions?
I made a comment about, you were asking about Jesus preaching to the people in prison, remember? And I said that that was in Ephesians. As I got on the road to go home, I thought, you stupid idiot, it's in 1 Peter. So if you were looking for it in Ephesians, it ain't there. It's in 1 Peter chapter 3.
Any questions tonight? I think that we struck more of a pace and got into the mindset a little bit, and so we understood a little better as we went along what Isaiah was. Fewer questions tonight, in other words, because we're getting into the groove of the prophecy and, that it was written, how it was written for those people at that time, and that kind of thing. So.
You got to do that. If you don't understand that, you won't ever understand the theological truths that are there.
And I love, though, the fact about the fulfillment that can be fulfilled numerous times, and then, of course, ultimately fulfilled by Jesus. Certainly rings true with what we've all been taught and believed all of our lives.
And can still be fulfilled.
Exactly.
The teachings that are truths can still be fulfilled. Even if it's been fulfilled to the nth degree with Jesus,
right,
it can still be fulfilled with us.
Man of sorrows, rejected by men. This whole passage seemed to be a description of Christ, but it seemed like what you described was this is a description of God's servant, which was Israel, but is now the church. So are we supposed to be like sheep as before Ashur and remain silent, irregardless of the persecution?
Sometimes yes. Sometimes yes. Because circumstances change. There are times when in the course of history, as it churns on, the people of God are going to be persecuted. And when the people of God are persecuted, we fulfill we just get whooped up upon it. And of course, this was the terminology that they used at that time because that's what happened to those people at that time when they were carried off into Babylonian captivity. Well, it may come a time when that'll happen to us again. And unfortunately, that part will be fulfilled. We don't really want that part to be fulfilled, do we? But it's still the case that it might be.
But part of the question was whether we suffer in silence, or how much do we stand up and say, hey, this isn't right, or whatever.
Oh, okay, yes. Well, sometimes you have to be silent in order to make a stand. In other words, just what Jesus was. Jesus didn't really, the idea that Jesus never said anything during the trial is clearly not true. He opened not his mouth. Well, he did. But that's really irrelevant. In other words, Jesus didn't really argue with them. And he knew that it was stupid to try to fight them. And sometimes you have to just simply throw in the towel. But by throwing in the towel and not compromising what it is you stand for, you have made a witness, which is what the people in Babylon were doing. They couldn't get away, and they were being persecuted, but they tried to keep the faith and stay the course, and their sacrifice led to the fact that there was a restoration of the people of God back in Judah, and there's another era of history for the people of God. And of course, there were other eras after that.
That's a good question, because I think we wrestle with how much do we speak out and take a stand, or
Yeah. So sometimes we have to, what shall I say? Sometimes the better part of wisdom is to keep your mouth shut.
well, it's still
Sometimes it's maybe you don't want to, but it's smarter to do that.
Anybody else have a comment or a question? Okay, sure.
It's not so much a question, but just an observation, and maybe this is obvious to everybody else, but I was struck by the fact that we're talking about 4 centuries here, from 8th, 7th, 6th, 5th centuries BC, where God is doing this thing with his people. And it reminds me of the 400 years that the Hebrew people were in captivity in Egypt, where God was doing a work in and through them.
Hundreds of years.
Yeah, I just think that it's interesting that there's that much similarity, both in the time span and in the nature of what was happening over that long period of time.
Well, sometimes we have to be more patient than we would like to be. 400 years is a long time.
It sure is.
4 generations even would be a long time.
Yeah, we expect to see things done in our lifetime, at least. We don't want to have it span over 400 years. Anyway, well, let us, we're going to stand and we're going to sing one verse of 473. In the church I grew up, we sang this every single Wednesday night, Sunday night, the first verse. And we don't sing it here very often, but it's a great hymn of fellowship. Blessed be the tie that binds. I'm just going to lead it a cappella, as we say. Blessed be the tie that binds our hearts in Christian love, the fellowship of kindred minds is like to that above. Would you close us in prayer?
I would be happy to. Well, I've got this. Oh, okay, I'll use this one. I would be a rock star. Well, first of all, let me say how much I appreciate being here and appreciate your patience and willingness to listen. Maybe, I've given you something to meditate and cogitate about, and I hope so. All right, let us pray. Lord, we are grateful for the opportunity to come into your house or to go anywhere and hear your word and study your word. We know that many people in this world in which we live are not able to do that, but have to study your word almost in the darkness because of the forces that want to wipe out your word. Grant unto us that we may be beacons of light, teaching your word in this dark world that needs to hear your word so much. And help us to be beacons of light in the way in which we conduct ourselves in our daily living. We ask that you would bless this church and these people and all the people all over the world who try to be faithful to your word. For we ask it in Christ's name and for his sake. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Let's give a clap offering to the Lord.